Over to you, Bridget.
Thank you. I hope you can all see my slide and it's not got anything weird going on.
It's great.
Cool, thank you. So, kia ora koutou. Today we will focus on gathering together the information worked through in the first two sessions. We'll start with a quick recap of this, so if you weren't able to attend the first two, you will hopefully get a bit of a sense of things, and you can go back and watch the recordings later. Our aims for this session are to compile the information gathered in sessions 1 and 2 into a draft map, add a couple more pieces to the map, where the elements are mandatory if applicable, or optional, and where the elements are repeatable, and briefly touch on other helpful information to include. You're probably sick of the sight of this now, but just to refresh the memory, here is the MARC record that we've been working on. I'll just quickly recap the information we have compiled. Firstly, the manifestation description in table form from session 1. Next, this is the expression description we compiled in session 1. And thirdly, the work description. Then from session 2, here is the summary of the 4 recording methods: identifier in blue, structured description in green, unstructured description in yellow, IRI in pink, and finally, here are the relationship and attribute elements from session 2, with the relationships in yellow, connecting one entity with another, and the attributes in green, describing a characteristic of an entity. Combining the information we've collated so far creates the following table. I have left the elements for each entity in the order in which they appear in the MARC record. If you want to be freer of MARC, you could alphabetize them while keeping the manifestation, expression, and work elements together. You could also experiment with another ordering entirely. For the structured descriptions, I have included hints as to what manner of structured description would be used. VES stands for Vocabulary Encoding Scheme, a thesaurus or a list of terms, and AAP stands for Authorized Access Point, i.e. a name or name title heading. Coming back to the map, we now have its draft skeleton, so we will start the process of fleshing it out more. There's a couple of other things that need to be specified, as I mentioned earlier. whether elements are mandatory if applicable, or optional, whether elements are repeatable. We won't work through every element in the map now because a lot of these decisions depend on your context. I'll just highlight a few examples to illustrate. In the first webinar, I put forward the following questions to consider for each resource entity. Do these elements describe this work, expression, or manifestation? Do these elements distinguish this work, expression, or manifestation from that work, expression, or manifestation? These questions are good to keep in mind when considering which elements are necessary and which are just useful. Which elements are a have-to-have regardless of anything? Which are a have-to-have if relevant? Which elements will be useful to include in some contexts or circumstances? Mandatory elements will be the ones that are needed in any description of your resource entities, no matter the context. An example of a mandatory element is manifestation title proper. Your description of the resource really couldn't function at all without a label, in this case a title. Every description of a manifestation needs to have a title, regardless. Mandatory, if applicable, elements are those that can't always be used to describe a resource, but if they can be, they are deemed crucial. An example here is the element manifestation identifier for manifestation. For example, not every monograph has an ISBN, so it can't be recorded in every single instance. However, you might decide that if a manifestation does have an ISBN, it would be foolish not to include it. Optional elements may be those that you deem important in some contexts, but not in every context. An example here might be work, category of work. You might decide to include this only for literature and certain genres of nonfiction. For example, historical fiction, poetry, true crime stories, travel writing. In other words, not every single work entity description would need this element included, in which case your map would need to include some sort of scoping information as a guide. An example I raised in the second webinar is manifestation publisher agent. I suggested institutions may decide to record this only for publications they themselves have produced, for example. Of course, an institution may decide that this is a mandatory element if applicable, and it would most often be applicable, that it should be recorded for every manifestation that provides publisher information. The flip side is that an institution may decide not to use this element in any circumstance, in which case it won't be recorded in the map. So, just a side note here. If you are curious to know what official RDA defines as a minimum description, a description of a resource entity that includes only the elements that absolutely must be present, then you could read the minimum description of a resource entity guidance page in the toolkit. I decided not to go down this rabbit hole today, except I will say that it highlights some interesting issues with cataloging using official RDA when using MARC as an encoding standard. There are some awkward things about describing all three resource entities in a single metadata description set. Let me know if you're interested in a deeper dive into this. We are looking at what future webinar topics would be helpful for people as they plan for official RDA. So on to repeatableness. You should include in a map whether or not you can have more than one instance of an element in your description. We're already used to this. For example, the MARC manual includes information about whether a MARC field and subfield are repeatable, for example. An example of a non-repeatable element might be manifestation copyright date. You might decide that for your institution, only the most recent copyright date should be recorded on the manifestation. An example of a repeatable element is manifestation identifier for manifestation. You might decide to include all relevant ISBNs recorded on the resource. Similarly, from our previous set of examples, work category of work. In the example record for Alles Licht, das wir nicht sehen, I included both novels and historical fiction. So a more fleshed out map now looks like this. I have added a MARC encoding column on the right to loop back to webinar 1. I have included the first 3 elements for each resource entity because there isn't enough room on a PowerPoint slide for all of them. Some of these elements will need further notes to help the cataloger determine a value. So a notes column can be added as you work on the map and develop it for full implementation. Practicing with your map will alert you to what's needed. Some immediately obvious notes for the map in the previous slide include when to use optional additional recording methods. For example, also record as an unstructured description if language of expression is a language other than English. When to use optional elements. For example, record a value for category of work if work being described is fiction, literature, or one of the following non-fiction genres. Vocabulary encoding schemes used for structured descriptions and identifiers. For example, use viz RDA content type or use a term from LCGFT thesaurus. String encoding scheme instructions for compiling an authorized access point. For example, for authorized access point for expression. Transcription instructions for transcribed unstructured descriptions. For example, title proper. Once you've got to this stage for a resource, the next stage could be to run other resources through the process. This gives you a chance to consolidate your thinking around official RDA, and it will also reveal what other RDA elements you use on a regular basis that are missing in this particular example. Remember that we've been keeping things very simple here. Focus on resources that are static, non-aggregates with text as the content type, i.e. textual monographs that are complete when published. For example, you could work on a large print book, a work of non-fiction, an e-book, a children's fiction title. As I mentioned in passing back at the beginning of webinar 1, we've been working through the most straightforward resource scenario, the best place to start. What about the others? More than one content type, text and still image, for example, poetry and short story compilations, serials, the dreaded classical CD. You can choose to have one master application profile that covers off what you need, or you could create application profiles for each of your collection scenarios, whichever makes the most sense for you. All of this might seem a lot of work in an already busy environment. However, there are some benefits to spending some time thinking through this. The move to official RDA gives us an opportunity to review current practice and decide if everything we do is necessary and useful, and to figure out what, if anything, is going to prove problematic in an official RDA environment. Particularly if you source records from a variety of places, thinking through these steps will help decode what's going on in other people's records. Why has this element suddenly appeared? You should hopefully be able to decide if what someone else is doing is something necessary and useful, and what the implications are for retaining or removing elements from records that you are bringing in. We also have the opportunity to think forward. Official RDA doesn't instruct us on what to do in the way content standards in the past have. It's about choice. So we record our choices in a map. By taking this opportunity to design a map that puts MARC in the passenger seat instead of the driver's seat, we can be better prepared for future changes to systems and encoding standards, for example. It's easier to retain focus on what we are recording when the how changes, sometimes dramatically. Reviewing current practice in splendid isolation can be a bit daunting. So here's a couple of suggestions for support and information. There are several institutions and communities who have included policy statements in the RDA toolkit. The National Library of New Zealand has included policy statements for every element in the toolkit, a mammoth effort. If you're wondering about an element and you're not sure what it achieves and whether it's worth thinking about including, you could look at the policy statements on the element page in the toolkit. For example, you might decide that if NLNZ has "do not record this element" as its policy, then you shouldn't feel obliged to use it. Keep an eye out for other metadata application profiles. These should be popping up increasingly between now and implementation in May 2027. The National Library has their maps available in the Documents section of the RDA toolkit. There's one for each resource permutation. Apart from the National Library of New Zealand, key communities to keep an eye on are the Program for Cooperative Cataloguing, PCC, in North America, and the Australian community, where the National and State Libraries of Australasia, NASLA, are currently working on the official RDA project for Australia. I mention these two particularly for libraries who source catalogue records from North America and Australia as well as New Zealand. Finally, if you're puzzling over something to do, reach out to the CAT SIG community on the CAT SIG listserv, for example. I hope this series of webinars helps to illustrate how we can give ourselves a head start when thinking about official RDA. You don't need to build a metadata application profile from scratch. We can take this opportunity to review what we're currently doing, to see if it's doing the job, and to think about whether it will continue to do the job in the future. And then just some useful pages and things. I'll just do another plug for the RDA Toolkit guidance pages. So this time we'll spotlight the page about application profiles. This explains what you should include in your application profile. The resource description page, The table of contents on this page here is a useful jumping off point for multiple guidance pages on describing resources. And again, just the links for subscription information for the RDA Toolkit. So either via the RDA Toolkit website directly or as part of your EPIC subscription via the National Library. And then if you're looking for more videos in RDA, then the RDA Toolkit YouTube channel is a great place to start. I'll just do a plug for Charlotte Christensen's excellent Finding Your Way with RDA trilogy from 2023. It's a fantastic overview of RDA and it's well worth watching. So yeah, a big thank you to Charlotte for these. And then in 2020, Kate James produced a series of very short videos on foundational RDA concepts. This is also worth dipping into. And that's it. I'll stop sharing and see if anybody's got any questions. Okay, great. Thank you. Thank you. I'm glad it was helpful, and I hope it's like a springboard to people kind of being able to review what they're currently doing. Yeah, thank you. I guess one of the things that would be helpful for us to know is what other areas people would appreciate going over together. For example, I mentioned the minimum description, which is an interesting subject in the context of MARC, where you've got work, expression, and manifestation together in one single record. But then, of course, they're three separate entities. So the whole connecting them together thing is interesting with respect to minimum description. So yeah, let me know if you think that would be worthwhile covering off in a session. And the other thing I'm wondering about is if people are interested in going over, for example, aggregates and amalgamations. So aggregates for, where you've got, for example, a collection of short stories, or a resource where you've got more than one work in a resource. And amalgamations are where essentially you've got, for example, a picture books where you've got your words and your illustrations that come together to create a work, but can be separated, but are still kind of recognizably from this work. I hope I've described that in a sensible fashion. Thanks, George, for adding that minimum description page link there. So what we'll be thinking about over the next few months is trying to think of topics that will be useful for the community to be thinking about, and also checking in with what's going on in Australia with training, and point you in the direction of any trainings that are like freely available, either via Oceania or more internationally. So If there aren't any questions about the stuff, it'll be the recording will be available on up on YouTube fairly promptly, I think, and we'll send out a link to the slides as well.
You're right, Bridget. Jess will probably have that up today, tomorrow.
Yeah, she's been great.
She has. She's a legend. All right. Look, on behalf of us all, thank you so much for the time, your wonderful, accessible way you've presented the information. And I bet it's going to be great, waking up tomorrow and going, yay, I've done them all, and having this off your plate. So yeah, on behalf of everyone, thank you so, so much. You've given so much. If there's no more questions, I will close with karakia. The words are in the chat. Keep an eye on LIANZA's events section on our homepage. If you're on your CPD journey and using these events for your points, Bridget's 3 events would correlate to 2 CPD points, and the Te Tautura heading you'd be using would be collections, records, and archives management. So, yeah. Once again, thanks, Bridget, and I'll close up. Ono hia te pō whiri marama, tomo kia te ao whatu tangata. Tātai ki runga, tātai ki raro, tātai ahorau. Humi e, hui e, tā ki e. Kia ora. Thanks a lot.